I want to invite the first of our speakers today, Fernando Carou, who is a senior engineer leading the community energy planning program at the City of Toronto, indeed one of the municipal leaders in Ontario in this area. And he is in charge of assembling the technical, financial, financing, and policy framework for new district energy systems in the city. Before joining the City of Toronto in 2011, he developed and managed energy, environmental, and sustainability programs for over 18 years in the manufacturing, asset management, and development consulting and petroleum industries across Canada and the United States and Mexico. He holds an engineering degree from the University of Toronto and sustainability training from the Harvard University Extension School. Fernando.
So thank you very much, Mark, and for the introductions. You know, Sean and Noel, actually, I think you're making very good points that hopefully I'll be able to highlight. I truly believe, actually, that the local sphere. Can anybody hear me there? I think not because I work for a city, but I truly believe actually that the local arena really is where this innovation actually is happening, and for good reason actually. It's a bottom-up approach actually, and that's actually really the battleground of where these issues are coming to a head. So Sean mentioned actually the TD report, which I'll go into a little bit on the middle section there, which talks about the growth pressures, right, in an urban environment, and how do we deal with it from an energy point of view. But first, actually, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're calling actually the spatial approach, maybe, and that's just the concept that community energy planning happens at different scales. There's different speakers this morning actually that will talk about different scales of the issue, but I wanted to highlight the fact that where matters, right? So the energy systems, electric or natural gas, they have a certain footprint. They can move at a certain pace. So it matters actually to track, where is growth happening on the ground, and how does that actually match, with the existing infrastructure. And then more positively, what can we do, right? So can we achieve the proverbial, win-win-win, right? Defined as not only actually achieve energy security, but if you do it in a certain way, right, you can get to that environmental benefit through resource conservation and reduction, and through local investment, right? These systems being done at the local level, they can actually contribute to economic development. So that's sort of the setup, and I hope to convince you of that, if you're not convinced already. So this is actually an example of where community planning actually comes into and interacts with land use planning. And I guess, in a sense, when I started working on this, a couple of years ago, I was actually very surprised that at the municipal level, we plan for everything. Planners are awesome. They have this big tent approach. They look at everything, public art, how the street is going to look, tree canopy, right? But I was actually really surprised to find out that energy, in fact, right? Energy is not part of that land use, planning process. So in this case, this is a location actually in the Etobicoke Lake Shore, where community planners were doing a secondary plan, which essentially it's planning speak for growth plan, right? So before development comes in, they try to sort of hire an urban planner, consult the community, and they look at all the big issues in terms of, in this case, access to the lake, heights, views, shadows, and so on. So then what we did actually is collaborated with planning to put in the energy perspective into that. So the way it looks actually is you have an area actually that is going to grow. So there's an urban aesthetic to it, I guess, sort of a plan with which planners can then compare actual development applications and say, okay, is this actually hitting the goals? Is this doing what the community wants? But from that, once we have a concept, then we can actually do the energy overlay. And that's what we are calling a community energy study. So you can do the planning as a whole, and then you can study things at a smaller scale. And so where matters and details matter as well. So depending on the type of development, in order to integrate and do custom solutions, you have to get to that level. So what was the purpose of this community energy study? Well, the idea was to actually address or join the long-term use, land use, with energy, right? And so it goes through very pedestrian steps, which is looking at energy load profiles of buildings, both existing and proposed new buildings. But more importantly, actually, is really to identify opportunities to address energy growth, where it happens, at the source, right? An ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure, right? So if you get to the source, actually, then you don't have to have the big, what I'm going to call, in a lovingly way, the central large system, I guess, right? The kind of the mainframe, right? The elephant is, right? So if we can do it at a local level, actually, right, and take growth off the shoulders of the elephant, right, then we have a pretty good thing going, a little more nimble. And in fact, I'm not going to say that it's either or. In fact, both systems, and I'll get into that later on, are the solution. We've just been exercising one muscle, the big one, and not doing anything at the local level. So we're weak there. So then, again, typical, steps. So essentially trying to plot, different courses of action, different destinies. And it shows actually that as time goes by, right, these destinies diverge significantly. And I'm not talking about actually any, although I know you have, there's probably a lot of researchers in the room and so on. I'm not talking about esoteric, technology here. Sean made the point actually, this is all off the shelf, okay, true and tried technology. This is really about implementation. Not even about financing either, because these projects actually do turn, so there is a business case, there is actually a return on these projects. So really what we're talking about is an organizational challenge. It's a challenge actually of integrating energy with land use as early as it happens, right? And then illustrating some scenarios. Which path do we want to take? Do we want to take the business as usual and go for maximum energy use? Or do we have actually varying degrees of opportunity, depending on how far we want to go? And stakeholders play a major role. The city is not in control necessarily. So the idea actually is to outline these scenarios and then hopefully get some implementation. So what is the conclusion actually of that study? Well, quite simply, right, there is an opportunity. So we were not surprised, right? There is an opportunity to integrate energy solutions within the building form, at the building scale, at the block scale, at the multi-block scale, in a way actually that results actually in the win-win-win. And we're sort of calling that the embedded energy solution, right? In a sense, so it's even more than integrated. It's just it can be part of the development, right? And the major buckets of that embedded energy solutions, actually, one of them is clearly conservation, but not just regular conservation, deep conservation, targeted conservation, right? The other one actually is building scale local energy. What can you do at the building scale, right? But then go beyond that. There's actually economies of scale and there's strengthening numbers. Remember that energy goes one way, cash comes the other way, right? So at the block scale, you can do things that normally are not economically feasible at the building scale. And the last one actually is a bucket, sort of for everything else. And you can in there you can put in, natural gas stations, for transportation and so on. And I should mention that transportation, unfortunately, was not part of the study, so it focused on buildings. So what were the recommendations, right? Went through all this work, you integrate things and look at different pathways. Well, the recommendations were pretty simple as well. So, for the city to actually do these exercises, outreach to the community, and more importantly to the other stakeholders that are going to be more in the decision roles, right? And then last but not least, which is I think a very powerful recommendation, is to ask developers when they submit their site plan applications, because they know a lot more about their buildings and developments than staff would know to begin with. So do the work, right, and see what the opportunities are at that scale. So if you're building one building, what are the opportunities at the building scale? If you're building 4 or 5 buildings, what's the opportunity at the 4 or 5 building scale? Like, I'm shocked when I talk to developers, actually, they tell me that, they do 4 or 5 building developments, and they have 4 and 5 mechanical rooms. Interesting. They never seem to put 4 or 5 pools. So where's the concept actually of shared energy services, around development, right? So it can be done. It's an organizational transition. So moving on to a different opportunity. This one actually is one that is dear to my heart. The Yolk University campus. I've been doing a lot of work with Yolk on this. It's driven by Yolk. So the city actually is basically an advisor and a cheerleader. And the idea here actually is quite simple. There's a significant amount of development that is happening at York, both academically and also commercially. So the commercial development actually is being fueled primarily by the subway going to York University. So mass transit comes in, right? It actually fosters intensification. Community planners come in, kind of like what I showed you before. They come up with a secondary plan that is negotiated and so on. And then it illustrates, so all the colored blocks, that's actually new development. So then, again, there's actually different perspectives. And York actually is engaging right now in trying to do an energy master plan, which is, the equivalent of community energy plan. Because the plan actually includes more than the university. It includes the community as well. So what would be the way to do this? It's not only about connecting the dots, it's about positioning the dots, okay? So if I'm actually an administrator, the president of York, what do? Do I look at energy as a cost, sort of lowly energy, right? Or do I look at it actually as an imperative, as a strategy to drive, top goals like leadership and sustainability, revenue generation and so on? So bear with me for a second. So the logic goes like this. The upper part actually of the campus, which is going to be commercial development, right, is owned by York. So York actually, through their development corporation, has the ability to actually put a positive covenant, and sorry for the technical speak, but they can actually compel developers actually that develop in their land to connect to their system, right? Their system, in fact, actually is very close to where the new development is going to happen. So York already has a district energy system, right? So the win-win here actually is the central system, the district energy system at York actually is old, requires significant investment, so that can be seen as a cost, right? But the opportunity to actually drive revenue actually from all this land, and by that upgrade the system, right? And in fact actually have utilities become a net income, because provide net income. The campus right now has 7 million square feet. If you do the math, they have growth for 14. So the reverse, they're going to actually make money through energy, not the other way around. And then last but not least, actually, by having that, right, through leadership and sustainability and so on, there's also the opportunity to integrate actually all this as a living lab for academic pursuits, right? And not just any academic pursuits, multidisciplinary pursuits. So this involves actually a new school of engineering that's coming along. It involves actually, environmental science. There will be contracts, yes. There will be policy, absolutely. There will be business case, for sure. There will be marketing, yeah, right? So it's a huge opportunity actually for York, as it's going about this business of going from good to great, to really actually engage energy, not as a low cost and just pay the bill, but as a imperative, as a strategic, option. So sorry for the evangelizing there, but we'll move on. It's such a good opportunity that if it doesn't happen, I'm going to cry. So please, don't make me cry. Okay, so since we are Ryerson, Ryerson actually is part of the picture as well. So I'm not as familiar, and we haven't actually engaged as much with Ryerson as we have with York, but Ryerson actually is going through the same sort of thought process. There's actually growth in enrollment. There's an ability or a need actually to want to be a sustainable leader, an ability to be relevant, actually and have curriculum actually that is relevant, right? So we're going to be working with York much more closely through the master plan and the other things. Then the city also actually is not just evangelizing. We're also doing our own work. So this is quickly a district energy business case that turned into reality now, where we have a hotel coming in for the Pan Am Games, and that hotel actually will not have its mechanical room. It'll have a swimming pool, but no mechanical room, right? So the mechanical room actually is not there because we are going to tie in existing assets, energy plants, at Exhibition Place, and we're going to power that hotel. So the hotelier actually first of all said, okay, how much? He said, well, it'll be the same. Okay, good. And why should I do this? Well, because you're planning on doing, VIP entertainment on the roof. So how would you like to have no cooling towers and no pumps? And more space, by the way. He said, oh, great. So we can watch the Indy from up there. Excellent. Right? So it's going to happen. It's approved. Okay, to the second part of it. This is actually more closely to what Sean was referring to in terms of growth and so on. So we've all read the news, right? You know, what's happening in this space. Downtown Toronto population growth triples from 2006 to 2011. A ton of high-rise construction everywhere. You know, you can see cranes absolutely everywhere. Issues where the existing electrical infrastructure doesn't map well with where the growth is happening, right? More load, great. Transit, I could have used more transit this morning to get here in time. So we're going to get it, but it's electric, right? Which is great, but it's going to actually add to the load, right? Same thing with Pan Am, you know, construction, right? We want those facilities, right? But it's going to be more opportunities for energy solutions. Conservation, we could do more. You know, is the grid stressed? So the idea actually is that, you know, to put it actually technically, there's an electricity crunch, right? And it's happening because of very quick and explosive, you know, population growth, which is a good problem to have. But at the same time, actually, we have a capped electrical system, right? The electrical system cannot move as quickly as development is. And again, because of the unintegrated way in which we plan for electricity and energy, right? These two things shall never meet, right? So then we end up with an imbalance, and that's hopefully what community energy planning will address, you know, from the get-go, right? For municipalities not to have a growth plan without having an energy plan, right? Kind of makes sense, right? So there's the green area, which is the central and downtown, which we are here today, and it's constrained, and we're pretty much the balance of supply and demand actually are equal. But we have 180 condos coming, so you do the math. So what's the solution here? How do we match supply with all this new demand, right? And clearly, again, I'm going to lovingly call it the old way, right? But what we've been doing for 100 years, right? Which is essentially, you know, large solutions, right? So large transmission, large generation. We need those. Okay, that's the backbone. I'm not arguing that we don't need that. In fact, we need to reinvest. And the last thing the provincial government needs actually is, you know, if they need to reinvest, actually, let's actually make sure that, you know, we don't put growth on top of that, right? So let's keep it steady and then deal with urban energy growth at the source, right? And that's what this is implying. You know, we have two muscles we can exercise. One of them, which we've exercised, you know, almost to death, and we're getting, you know, diminishing returns, right? This other one that hasn't been exercised at all, in my view. So it'll be a better system if we can do both. You know, the local solutions actually, in fact, will remove pressure off the large system. So what are the characteristics of the big system? It's vulnerable, you know, to low probability, high impact events, all eggs in one basket. It's definitely 100% public dollars, right? With few exceptions. It takes energy dollars out from Toronto because we don't generate enough in Toronto. It's got huge lead times, and that's actually where the concern is with all this growth, right? It will not react in time, in my view. And it actually finds public opposition here and there. We're all reading, you know, the reports about Mississauga and Oakville and so on, right? You know. So is there a better way? Or is there a way that we can actually help the big system? And I believe there is, actually. And we're calling this embedded energy solutions. So more than integrated, basically part of the infrastructure. So what do they do, actually? Well, they keep energy dollars in the jurisdiction because you trade leaky dollars, right? You know, dollars that go out of the jurisdiction with sticky dollars actually that, you know, stay through projects, right? We attract private investment. It's not only actually a provincial game, right? It's efficient. We can do heat recovery at the source, which is something that's hard to do actually outside of the jurisdiction. Reduced, you know, emissions for sure, and also increased flexibility because it's the multiple eggs in multiple baskets sort of approach. And we have data to prove it, you know, from conservation efforts, right? That now, you know, from years of doing conservation at the City of Toronto, we have almost 2,000 projects, right? 440 million square feet of buildings renovated, created 29,000 person years of employment, 655 million of economic impact within the city. Because every renovation you do, actually, it's in the city, and it reduces actually leaky dollars getting out of the jurisdiction, right? You know, cost savings, huge. Makes our industry and our businesses more competitive. Why not? What's not to like, right? And then we have actually a reduction of emissions. Okay? So again, embedded energy solutions, it's not a silver bullet approach. It's many things, but done at the source at multiple scales, right? So it's basically conservation, everything that we do, we just need more of it. Combined heat and power, district energy storage, both thermally and electrically, demand response, shave the peak, shave the system peak, renewables, right? So this is where I like for you to think about this for a second, right? And I guess you're in two camps. Either we want different results or we don't. So if you don't, fine. You don't need to listen to this. Now, if we want actually different results, right, then let's do things differently. Quite simply, right? Okay, so mild suggestions, if I were king. So this is just a protocol one. For the province to officially recognize that cities and towns have an active role to play in energy. Why? Because cities and towns can address demand growth at the source with smart planning, attracting private investment, which can actually support local economic development and achieve environmental benefit, right? Ministry of Energy to instruct the Ontario Energy Board and the OPA, give them some flexibility to focus actually on these solutions, right? And more importantly, actually, or by doing that, actually, it can take pressure off the existing large system, which needs to be reinvested. So deal with growth at the source, let the system sort of rehab itself. And this one actually is pointed to, obviously, where we are and the sponsors of this seminar. Don't look at energy as a cost, okay? You're academic institutions. You have huge resources, right? You're all about doing things differently, right? So look at embedded energy solutions as a strategic imperative, okay? Run with it, okay? It can generate revenue, new revenue. You can make money, right? It actually will help actually propel you, or at least remain your leadership in sustainability. And there's also a huge opportunity, which I see. I wish I had this when I went to school. I wish I had a living laboratory, where things were happening that were of consequence, right? So let's do curriculum actually that solves problems, for our time, right? Let's engage. Let's not just evangelize, right? Let's just do something about it.